All right, I've got 10 o'clock by my watch, so I think we're going to get started here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to be here today with, I'm Whitney Gleason, and I'm the Water Quality Program Manager for the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy, and I'm joined by our conservationist, Carol Markham, and of course, our wonderful speaker, Dr. Doug Tallamy, as well as our wonderful co-host, Lindsay, from the Canandaigua Lakes Watershed Association. And we are going to start off. Lindsay's actually going to take it away and tell us a little bit about some upcoming programs before we get started with our main presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Whitney and Carol and Doug. So hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay, and I'm with the Canandaigua Lake Watershed Association, and we're thrilled to be here this morning, partnering with our friends at the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy for today's webinar. So we wanted to take a few quick minutes before we get into today's presentation to welcome you to this. It's actually the second webinar of the inaugural Lake Friendly Living Awareness Week. This Awareness Week has been the collaboration of so many great watershed and lake associations across the region and across the state, really, all coming together to bring you a series of virtual talks and workshops aimed at inspiring and educating residents, businesses, elected officials on the many ways that we as residents can make an impact on the health of our lakes. So at the bottom of the slide, you'll see many of the Lake and Watershed Association partners that make up the Lake Friendly Living Coalition of the Finger Lakes. We want to recognize and thank our event sponsors. We're thrilled to partner with Chautauqua today on this event. The Nature Conservancy is also a sponsor for the events coming up throughout the week. And we've also partnered with many of the soil and water conservation districts, cooperative extension offices, and municipal partners across the region for this great event. So we encourage you to check out our landing page and look at the great lineup of events we have for the whole week. The topics range from incorporating native plantings to healthy shorescaping options, to the impacts from invasive species, and to best management practices that are being used by our vineyard producers. There really is something for everyone, so check it out. And so this Awareness Week is just one example of the many activities that we can work collaboratively on to spread the message of lake stewardship. Our watersheds face many similar threats, and working together as a coalition, we can have a collective impact reaching far beyond what we could all do alone. So we encourage you to visit the websites of your local watershed groups and lake associations to learn more about the many programs and projects that we all have going on to protect our lakes. And while you're there, consider taking the Lake Friendly Living pledges associated with your watershed, where you can become a champion in your neighborhood by assessing the activities around your property and selecting low impact management strategies to protect our local environments. And we have a collective goal of getting 500 pledges across the region this week, and I'm really hopeful that we can get there. So stay connected, get involved, and take advantage of the local knowledge and activities occurring in each watershed. In Canandaigua, our pledge is really focused on lawn care. So it's starting simply by looking at the lawn care activities you're doing and choosing a healthy option that protects water quality. I know Chautauqua has a really great lakescapes program run by Carol, where she'll come out and do an assessment of your property and offer some options for a naturalized landscaping that'll help support wildlife and pollinators. And several of our other area Finger Lakes have lake-friendly living pledges, which take into consideration many of the activities that happen inside and outside of your home. So this morning, we're thrilled to get started and learn from Doug Tallamy on how we can work alongside nature, not against it, to build backyards that can support a healthy array of insects, pollinators, and songbirds. So I'll turn it over to Whitney to introduce our guest speaker today.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thank you for that update on all the programs. And like she said, there's so many wonderful things going on. So get out there and try to get involved. So we're so excited today to have Dr. Doug Tallamy here with us. He is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 80 research articles and has taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, and other courses for 32 years. Chief among his research goals is to really better understand the many ways that insects intersect with plants, and how those interactions determine the diversity of our animal communities and really affect those relationships. So he has been recognized many times for his work, including the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence. And we are so lucky to have him here with us. So please feel free, if you have any questions while Doug is presenting, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We prefer you put them there than in the chat. Things tend to get lost in the chat as it scrolls. So if you put them in the Q&A, we won't lose them, and they're really easy to keep track of at the end of the presentation for our live Q&A. So with all of that, Doug, take it away.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm afraid that's an old CV you got a hold of. I've actually been at Delaware 40 years at this point. So.
Oh, wow. Well,
time marches
on. I apologize for that, but 40 is even more impressive.
Well, yeah, I'm still alive, I guess. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I do want to talk to you about my idea of what nature's best hope is today. But before I do that, I want to talk about what happened in 2019. We had what we call an oak mast in the fall of 2019. All the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I stared at it. But I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a hole for its head, stuck its head through there, then forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plopped down. This is a dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds, but down it goes. And then it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what a weevil looks like. A lot of people think they have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole. And that's how the larva gets down there. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year? Because it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. If they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after the weevil leaves the acorn, it leaves a hole, and that is a true vacuum. You know that nature abhors a vacuum. So in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of Temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils in acorns. And if they find a new acorn, they're excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it is time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, and even the queen, and off they go into the new hole. Then they post a guard. It takes about 30 minutes to move that whole colony into this acorn, but then they will stay there for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, "What is your point? What are you trying to tell us?" My point is that this is literally one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise the bulk of nature. These interactions are largely between animals and plants, but there are many of them. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. Or the relationship between witch hazel and winter moths. Winter moths are the primary pollinators of witch hazel, very late in the fall. This is one of the winter moths, the bicolored sallow. I actually caught one on Christmas Eve. That's how late they fly. Or the relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. Carpenter ants is what they rear their young on. And of course, you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the large trees that make carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have that plant, Phacelia. That is the only plant that bee, the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and more than a third of them are highly specialized. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So in the northern Midwest, there are at least 13 species of native bees that can only reproduce in the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. We could talk about these relationships all morning long. But the problem is today, these specialized relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge and said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that we can't do that now. We did not leave the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states. It's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it, got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and we have dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other such remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. You might wonder why we've done that. I wonder too. But I imagine we thought the Earth, our nest, was so big we could foul it forever and there just wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing pretty scary headlines on a regular basis now, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost 1/3 of our North American bird population gone. And now the UN says, well, gee, we're gonna lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they post these headlines as if it's just another headline. And they might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline. It's not an option to lose 1 million species. No more an option than it is to lose oxygen. So we've got to make sure these things don't happen. I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus, greatest entomologist of all times, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects. And he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change the energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, and even many of our freshwater fishes, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that as of now rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. Good news is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on natural ecosystems. We haven't evolved away from them. We're still totally dependent on them. So here's just a few things that plants, we call them ecosystem services, that plants deliver for us, but also for everything else. How about oxygen? Pretty important. Clean water. You know about water, you know about watershed management. It is plants that are managing the water in our watersheds, slowing its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use, cleaning it, preventing stormwater runoff, all of those good things. Carbon capture. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of the carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have stored there over the eons. Plants are building topsoil and holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather, converting sunlight into food. And if we were to lose our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight. I wish us luck. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of those flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds and other important things. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services, it's not a good idea. Never was a good idea. Today, it's actually a terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before. We have 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. That number gets bigger every minute, every second. So taking huge portions of the earth out of production, out of ecological production, so that we can have status symbols, it's just not a good idea. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said was, the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that for long periods, but our large Western societies and our large Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, then moving to another area doing the same thing. Clearly not sustainable behavior. Well, Aldo worried about this, but he did have faith. He thought that we humans were actually capable of developing what he thought, or what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough so that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he didn't write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this morning is that living with nature not only is an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature where there are a lot of people, actually rebuild it where we've dismantled it, because that's pretty much every place. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get smaller every day, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. That's because most of the land out there is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the whole country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because we won't be working in large enough areas, and the areas we do work on will be too disconnected from each other. There are lots of conservation opportunities, though, that we have not been taking advantage of, but we could be. How about power and pipeline rights, like rights of ways? 21 million acres in those landscapes. Railroad rights of ways, another 3 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are big areas. Roadsides, another 17 million acres. Then we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas and suburbia and our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those landscapes. If you add up just those, and you can think of others, that's 599 million acres where we could be doing a much better job of conservation than we are right now. How big is 599 million acres? It's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, Texas. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation almost anywhere. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm really talking about rebuilding nature in some form. It won't be exactly like what it was before we dismantled it. But if we reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that we have functional ecosystems again, they can produce ecosystem services, and we can save an awful lot of species plus ourselves. So I think it's worth doing. But in order to rebuild ecosystems, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem functions equally. So we have to start with the species that contribute the most. And there are two groups we can't do without: those flowering plants, that's certainly one group, and the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. Remember, these plants are capturing energy from the sun through photosynthesis, turning it into food, which is then stored in their leaves. Well, if you don't get that food from the leaves to animals, you don't have a functional food web. You don't have a functional ecosystem. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. That something typically is insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So when we're rebuilding nature, we've got to include landscapes that support a lot of caterpillars. Otherwise, we will have failed food webs and failed ecosystems. Let me give you an example from the Carolina chickadee. You've got the black cat chickadee up there. Practically the same bird doing the same things. Chickadees, of course, are very common at our feeders all winter long because they're eating seed there, and people think that's all they need. Well, in the wintertime, 50% of their diet is seed. The other 50% is insects, even in the wintertime. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will feed their young almost exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that a recent PhD student, Ashley Kennedy, did. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were bringing food to the nest. They were going to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diets of as many birds as she could in North America. And you're looking at a summary of the results. This is the nestling diet of 20 of the common bird families. And the green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we designed landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So it seems there's something special about caterpillars. There are a lot of other insects out there. Why are the birds focusing on caterpillars? Well, there are actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is they're soft. So think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is the exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because the caterpillar is soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. They take that beak and they just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have sharp edges. So it's hard to stuff them down the throat of your baby. Finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife, Cindy, makes sure I have access to lots of carrots to get my beta carotene, and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene, lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. And when I eat those things, they stimulate my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a healthy immune system. Carotenoids are antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. Improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this prothonotary warbler male who has had access to lots of luteins. And that's why he's bright yellow. He takes those luteins and he makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are these birds getting their carotenoids from? They're getting them from the prey that they eat, of course, but carotenoid levels are not equal across invertebrate prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other insect prey. The adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves, are way down here. So they don't have a lot of carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So this study and several others suggest that caterpillars are probably not optional parts of bird diets. It's really looking like they're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. By the way, so do many other things. We don't have time to talk about that. So we'll talk about birds. Birds need caterpillars. How many caterpillars do they need? Well, that's a good question. Let's go back to chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? Well, it takes thousands. 1 or 2 a day is not good enough. It takes many thousands, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get them to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. But after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed the baby's caterpillars for another 21 days. But they're flying all around. Nobody's been able to count that. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to rear one clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees breeding in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places, that's all that's left, you have to have those caterpillars in your yard. Because if you don't, chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They don't fly 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't have all those caterpillars in our yard, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is directly correlated with bird decline. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. That's the group that said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years, divided those terrestrial birds up into 2 groups, the species that require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they are breeding, and the species that don't. So things like doves and finches that can actually reproduce off of seeds. They didn't lose any numbers over the last 50 years, but the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as we remove insects from our landscapes, we're removing bird food, and that doesn't help them very much. So I think a new goal has to be to landscape in a way that includes insects, particularly caterpillars, and that is a new goal, because in the past we've landscaped only from the perspective of aesthetics. We didn't want anything eating our plants, so we made sure we had absolutely dead landscapes. All right, how do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, we do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. So that seems pretty easy, but there is a catch, and that is most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're going to put in our yards. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars that we're trying to support are very fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtles and all of the calorie pears and all the barberry and all the buckthorn and all the hostas and all the other ornamental plants that we brought in from Asia in your yard. And you won't have a single monarch butterfly. You won't produce a single monarch butterfly unless you have milkweed. That is the only plant they're going to be able to develop on. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why is that? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And it's a really effective defense. That's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. If you don't believe me, go outside and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not gonna like it. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. That's my little joke. But this isn't a joke. Insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, they specialize is the answer. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And any given insect species cannot adapt to all of them. So they pick 1 or 2 and that are very similar in their defenses, and they get good at getting around those particular defenses. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history with those compounds, or with those plant lineages, for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. And once they do fall into place, the insect is locked into eating those particular plant lineages because they didn't spend any time developing adaptations for other types of defenses. And that's why when we bring in plants from other continents, most of our insects cannot eat them. They've never seen those defenses before, and they haven't been able to adapt to them. And don't wait for them to adapt to them, because it takes many, many thousands of generations. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we are trying to reconstruct food webs in landscapes where we've wrecked them, we have to choose the right plants, or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house right here in Southeast Pennsylvania, Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. I'm sitting in that window right now, by the way. It was part of a farm that was broken up and sold in 10-acre lots. It was a very old farm, and the last thing they did before they sold it was mow it for hay. But when you mow for hay in this area, you're really mowing all the invasive plants that have escaped our gardens. Multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet, and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive and porcelain berry, and on and on and on. And you call that hay. And it's okay because they sell it to the mushroom industry, so it's really just organic material. But of course, when we built the house, they stopped mowing, and all those plants came back. None of those rootstocks were dead. So the entire 10 acres looked like this. It was just a giant tangle of Asian plants. That's my wife, Cindy, getting ready to clear the 10 acres. She did it. It is a lot of work. But she did it. That's the important thing. So if you have an invasive plant problem, don't give up. You really can beat it. You have to work at it, but you can beat it. So what was I doing while Cindy was clearing? I was telling her she was doing a great job, but I also was putting plants back. The object was to restore this 10 acres, restore the biodiversity on our property. And you're not going to do that unless you rebuild the caterpillar food web, caterpillar-based food web, by putting the plants in that support those caterpillars. So that was my job. I wanted to see if I could attract a Canadian owlet. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. That's what the adult looks like. Well, you're not going to do that unless you have its host plant, which is meadow rue. It's the only thing it's going to develop on. We didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue here hundreds of years ago before they farmed it to death, but long gone. I don't know where there's any meadow rue around here. So I got some seeds from someplace, planted the meadow rue, and then I just wondered, is a Canadian owlet going to be able to find it? Well, I really didn't think they would be able to find it. So I didn't go out and check it for a couple months after I planted it, but I walked by for some other reason, and the plants were loaded with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. And now we got a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. It was a big success. So there you go. We've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful moth actually has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I went and got some seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. It took a year for the moth to find our Bidens, but it finally did. And now we've got a good population of both of those. So we've added 4 species to the property. Want to see if I can get the hackberry emperor. Why? Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly that we have, but it belongs here. It's one of the species that ought to be here. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. We had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find our hackberry, but they finally did. I walked by one of my hackberries last June, and on a single branch, there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species, and that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod, like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come. That's what its caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. One of these years, I'm going to go out and check my goldenrod and I will find these caterpillars, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. People don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. Makes great nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. It's an excellent pollinator plant, believe it or not. Its flowers aren't big and showy. And if you want to make a good pollinator garden, you have to think like a bee, not like a human. Bees don't care how showy the flowers are. They want good access to good nectar and good pollen, and that's what Virginia creeper provides. And it's the major host plant for our large sphinx moths that actually are the major component of cardinal nestling diet. So things like the Pandora sphinx, and that's beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I can get the double tooth prominent, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Well, it's a specialist on elm. Of course, we didn't have any elm. So I got some seeds at the University of Delaware, right in the gutter. There are a couple of big elm trees that never died there. So they dropped seeds, scooped them up, planted them. Elm seeds grow really fast. In about 6 days, they germinate. This is 19 years later, and those trees are 80 feet tall. So another big success. Caterpillar came right away. American elm. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. We didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. Moth came, spends the day with his head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages I put back on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important trees. You may recognize this. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, well, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is delivering to your little local ecosystem, what it's doing for you ecologically, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50. And right away, they started to rebuild that food web with the moths that run that food web. Like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating those leaves. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oaks to start to contribute to your landscape. They contribute the very first year. This is what our house will look like in probably another week. The leaves are almost all out at this point. I'm still sitting in that window right now. So we've got lawn here, we're very traditional, but I put a lot of plants back. And I noticed right away when I put a new plant lineage in the yard, there's a potential of new moth species coming and strengthening that food web that supports all the other biodiversity on our property. So 4 years ago, I made it a goal to try to take pictures of every species of moth that I brought to our property, or that have colonized our property. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,048 species of moths on our 10 acres. Now we do have 10 acres, but Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area, we have 40% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And because so many of these are types of bird foods, we have recorded 59 species of terrestrial birds that have bred on our 10 acres, which is 38% of all the terrestrial birds that breed in North America, in Pennsylvania. Why is this important? Well, here's another headline that we saw this fall. World Wildlife Fund says we've lost 2/3 of the wildlife on planet Earth since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm sure we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3. And it didn't take that long, and all we had to do was put the plants back. That's something each one of us can do. So let's not accept these headlines as inevitable. We can turn this around. But I know what you're thinking. Cindy and I have 10 acres and many people have smaller plots in suburbia or cities. Will it work on smaller pieces of land? That's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. Well, the first thing they did when they moved into their house, and it's in the middle of suburbia, by the way, they are surrounded by everybody with the big lawns, but their yard was choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. So they got rid of that and they planted lots of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their yard. They're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Now, to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house, all on 0.6 acres. So yes, it works on smaller properties. What about city or urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of this wall is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all, totally isolated. So it's a pretty 1/10 of an acre, but it's a small little island. She did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature for those birds. And then she sat back and started to count the birds that have used her yard. She's up to 118 species of birds on her 1/10 of an acre, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. It's right there. What about in city centers, though? 82% of us live in cities. Well, 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, but that reminds me, we've got a serious marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Okay, I was staring at Monarch's Delight 2014, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of megachilid bees, of leafcutter bees, a big one and a small one. I know they're leafcutter bees because they collect their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very strict requirements. They not only do they need pollen and nectar, but they also need soft leaves. Leaves of redbud are perfect because they're very soft and pliable. They snip the edges of those leaves out and make little semicircles and roll up those semicircles and stuff them full of pollen and lay an egg on it. And then they put the whole package into a crack or crevice. And that's how leafcutter bees reproduce. Well, there was a redbud growing right next to Monarch's Delight, and I'm sure that's why those bees were there. They had everything they needed. Then I saw a bumblebee. Actually, there were a number of bumblebees there, and I'm pretty sure that's why they were there as well. Remember, bumblebees overwinter as queens. So when they come out in the spring, right now, they don't have any workers. Every bumblebee you see today is a queen trying to start a colony, and they need an abundant amount of flower and nectar, pollen and nectar to do that. And redbud supplies exactly that. So I'm pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees there. And then I saw a monarch, actually 2 monarchs. And this is all within 20 minutes. And they were foraging on Monarch's Delight. I was excited about this because this was 2014. I'd gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. That was the low point in the monarch population. Only 3.6% of the monarchs remained compared to 1976. And this was June, which is early on the East Coast to be seeing monarchs. So maybe the monarchs weren't going to disappear after all. It was a good day. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but there was another milkweed as well. I think it's purple milkweed. And so they had nectar, plenty of nectar, but they also had their host plant. And that's, of course, all they need. They were there because they had what they needed. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. If you haven't been to the High Line, it's a restored elevated railroad. It had been abandoned for decades. Somebody went up there and looked around, and there were a bunch of native plants that had seeded in, were taking care of themselves. So they decided to make it a tourist destination. And it's a very successful tourist destination. Literally millions of people go there every year. It's always crowded with people. And this is the extent of the nature that's up there. It's a little strip about 3 feet wide, 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of Manhattan. This is Rick Dark, who was always after me to go to the High Line and see the beautiful plants. Well, I'm not much of a city boy, so I drag my feet. But also when, if I see pretty plants with nothing using them, that's depressing to me. And that's what I thought I would see in the Highline. I mean, after all, what's going to find these plants in the middle of Manhattan? But I was totally wrong. I saw everything I just described to you within 20 minutes. Somebody's done a survey of the bees of the Highline. There are up to 30 species of native bees using the Highline. So it's proven to me that thoughtful native plantings can bring life back to Manhattan, which means you can probably do this just about anywhere. There are 4 things we need to think about, though, if we're going to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area that we have in lawn. We've got more than 40 million acres of lawn in this country, which is bigger than the size of New England, dedicated to a dead ecological landscape. It's a status symbol. And we're not going to get rid of our status symbols. I understand that, but we can cut them in half and still have high status. We can manicure what we keep, but we can put a lot of plants in the other half that's now in lawn. And if we do that everywhere, if we replant half the area that's now in lawn, that'll give us 20 million acres to work with. We can create a new national park. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympics National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we'll have the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? Well, you get the opportunity to develop, either for the first time or redevelop, a personal relationship with some part of the natural world. You could do it at your own pace, your own time. All you have to do is go outside. You can avoid crowds. If you go to a real national park, you're sitting in a traffic jam. I did that this summer. Millions of people go to these parks. It's also free. There's no admission fee. And it's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. This is really important. I don't know how you can develop that personal relationship, not a relationship mediated by somebody else, but a personal relationship with the natural world. And this is particularly important for our kids, because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. And if they don't have a relationship with the natural world, they're going to be lousy stewards. Richard Luce says they're suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we put 30 kids on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour. They go to a natural area and walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home. And I'm sure that's better than nothing, but it's really an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world right where they live, all they have to do is go outside alone. No parental supervision. Let them develop that relationship in a way that works for them. And they will be better stewards of the planet if they do. Maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest piece of nature. It's a little patch of lawn and a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. So she sent me this picture, very excited to tell me how to hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. And you crawl slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You take care of the lizard. You become a good steward of that lizard. And you have a personal relationship with some part of the natural world. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture recently, and she's still at it. But I guarantee that she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's book, Nature Play at Home, dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, go to our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. What you do is you put in your location, where you are in a particular county, and how much area you're pledging to convert, or you have converted from lawn to some type of natural planting. And your little piece of your county will light up with a firefly. And you'll get to see who else is doing this in your county. You can have competition among counties who's doing it more. The object, of course, is to really convert that 20 million acres and do it in a big way. I talk to the choir all the time. We're trying to get beyond the choir and get people interested. And if it takes social media to do it, then we're all for it. So we got about 7,000 people on the map so far. Doesn't cost you anything, and no, we're not using your data. So we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that was in lawn? Well, some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? This is the Roman arch. A keystone is a stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out, the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because the keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs, which means 85% of our native plants are contributing, but not all that much. If you think about, let's say we're building an ecological house in our yard, the keystone plants are the 2x4s of that house. They're essential. The house is not going to stand up without them. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, but it's not the only thing your house is built out of. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a number of natives that don't support viable food webs all that well. So let's put the most ecologically productive plants back into our landscapes. They're certainly better than benign plants and much better than those invasive ornamentals that we brought in, like calorie pear, like barberry, like burning bush, that escape our yards and biologically pollute, ecologically castrate all the natural areas around us. Invasive plants are ecological cancers. They just keep going. I get an email once in a while from somebody saying, don't I know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're doing anything ecologically or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They support 0 species of caterpillars. So they're there, they're occupying space, but they're not contributing to your local food web. What's contributing more than anything else? Well, in 84% of the counties of North America, oaks are the #1 keystone plant. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars, 557 species of bird food, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. This is an example of the power of keystone oaks in our yard here. Now, so far I've taken pictures of 1,048 moss species. I haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. I will, but not yet. Out of the 1,048, 922 have known host plants. So there's more than 100. I don't know what they're eating. Of the 922 species, 275 species use oaks. And we've got 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the genus Quercus, the oaks. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they're supporting at least 30% of our moss species diversity. One genus doing that. That's the power of a keystone plant. Imagine what would happen to the diversity in our yard if we took oaks away. How do you find out what the keystone plants are for where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder in the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both woody and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. This is what a typical list looks like. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. If I go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, I guarantee they will sell me an ornamental cherry, flowering cherry from Asia. If I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, it'll be a European birch, or a maple, probably be a Japanese maple. You have to specify that you want a native member of these genera. If you get non-native members, it's going to reduce caterpillar use by 65%. We've done that experiment. These are the top herbaceous genera both in terms of making caterpillars, but also supporting the specialist bees I was talking about earlier. Goldenrods support 110 caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic states. So they're productive, but they also support lots of those specialist pollinators. So if you have goldenrods, the various genera that asters were broken up into, and perennial sunflowers in your yard, you have the opportunity of supporting at least 40 species of bees that wouldn't be there otherwise. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light at night, which of course is not the goal. There's a good deal of research coming out of particularly Europe these days, which is pretty convincing, saying that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect decline. These are all the ways that lights kill our insects at night. This is actually good news to me, because we cannot tolerate insect losses any longer. Remember, our existence depends on insects. We just cannot continue to kill them. So we've got to turn that around. And if we can turn it around by simply flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. That's the easiest possible solution. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn the light off over my garage at night because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it so that it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white light out of your security bulb and put in a yellow bulb, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects than our white wavelengths. Yellow LED lights are the least attractive. If we switched out our white lights for yellow LED lights overnight, we would save billions of insects. And probably billions of dollars as well, because of all the energy savings. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects. We seem to have no end to the ways we like to kill insects. This is a booming business around the country, folks. Mosquito Joe is single-handedly undoing everything I've been talking about for the last 15 years. And he will say, well, it's okay because this is a natural product. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural product too. So he'll also say it only kills mosquitoes. Not even close. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with. I don't know if you caught some of the headlines last year about the big monarch kills during their migration when somebody was fogging. Not good. The big thing is it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You don't kill mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of the adults, which is really hard. Mosquito Joe, on average, kills about 10% of the adults. So he's not even close. And that's why he has to keep coming back. And that's why he has to charge you a lot of money. You're paying a lot of money for something that doesn't work. What does work? Control the mosquitoes in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in straw or hay, let it sit for a couple of days and more or less ferments and builds up diatoms and algae in your bucket, which is irresistible to ovipositing mosquitoes. They want to lay their eggs in that bucket. So when they do lay their eggs and those eggs hatch, put in a mosquito dunk, which is Bacillus thuringiensis. You get this at the hardware store. It's a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito, and it only kills aquatic diptera. So if a dragonfly gets in there, it doesn't hurt it at all. If your dog drinks it, or if a bird drinks it, no problem. So this is much more targeted, completely targeted against mosquitoes, and if everybody did it, it would exert some good control. Okay, the final thing we need to do is landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. Then they spin a cocoon and hang from the branch, and then they emerge as an adult, and they do it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most caterpillars don't. No matter what the tree is, they finish growing on the tree, but then they drop from the tree, wiggle their way beneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact our soil to the point where it's way too hard for a caterpillar to wiggle under. So this becomes an ecological trap. If these are keystone plants, the moths come in, lay their eggs, the caterpillars grow, and then they drop down and die. I am convinced that this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. And talk about watershed management. Holy moly's, that is just active watershed destruction. So you're wrecking your biodiversity, you're wrecking your watershed, causing stormwater runoff, and you're loading the atmosphere with CO2. Cement is a major source of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. Not much good about that. It's just a default landscaping approach out of laziness. Nobody wants to take care of it, so they cement it over. This is what most people do. You put a tree in the middle of a yard. Now, nobody's measured the success of caterpillars in a situation like this, but I guarantee it's higher in a situation like this, where you have a tree, you've got maybe a dogwood heron, native azaleas and ferns. You've got a well-planted landscape, which, by the way, is managing your watershed much better than lawn. Caterpillars drop down into a safe zone. They can easily get beneath the surface of the soil because it's not compacted. Nobody's going to step on them or mow them. There's leaf litter here. They can spin their cocoon. Survivorship will be much higher. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening, be very fancy about it. And this is how you reduce the lawn. You put a bed around your trees. Put a big bed around your trees. It becomes a safe site and another excellent way to manage your watershed. This is where you can put in your ground covers, things like wild ginger and mayapple and foamflower and ferns. Always the default fern is great. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia, right in the middle of the city. These are red maples. Any caterpillar developing on this tree can fall down into a safe site and actually complete its development. So we can do a lot better with the areas underneath our trees. Another grad student, former grad student, Desiree Narango, has done a wonderful job with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And the results of her study suggest there is room for compromise in our plant choice. What she did was compare the sustainability of chickadee populations in two types of landscapes. Landscapes that were dominated by native plants and landscapes that were dominated in a typical way by introduced plants. You know, we've measured the amount of introduced ornamentals in our typical landscapes in this neck of the woods. It is about 82% plants from Asia. So she found when you're talking about introduced landscapes, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now there's nest boxes up in every landscape, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even gonna try. If they did try, their nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of woody non-native plant biomass in your yard. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. It's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, it's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you reproduce down here, make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you're below that dotted line, have fewer babies than adults die, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap, generously speaking. So you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. Can't have invasive plants, but you can have the ginkgo or your boxwood or your crepe myrtle or your forsythia. Those are not invasive plants. And as long as they don't dominate the landscape, as long as 70% of your woody plant biomass is native, you can have sustainable chickadee populations. And those are model systems. It works for, I'm sure it works for other birds as well. This is the area of compromise I'm excited about. If my message was you can't have any non-native plants, very few people would listen because we love our non-native plants. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So if we increase the percentage of native plants, we can tolerate some of these. Can native plants be used formally? Of course they can. I got this just the other day from Lynn O'Shaughnessy. This is her design. Nothing more formal than that. Every plant in that design is a native plant. This is taken from a drone overhead. It's a big garden. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a yard like this, a typical suburban yard, without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells people that this is not just a pile of weeds. This is a planted garden with a goal, and the native bees will certainly enjoy it. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, there'd be a lot more forage for those bees. Remember why we need pollinators. I hear all the time, you need them because they pollinate our crops. Then people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. It's not 30% of the crops, by the way. It's 12% of the crops that are pollinated by our pollinators. So the real reason we need pollinators is because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants. Everywhere you want to manage that watershed, which is everywhere. How about this? This is a Drew Latham design. Imagine the amount of life here versus the amount of life here. Imagine the watershed value here versus the watershed value here. It all seems like a no-brainer to me. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And more of them are doing it. Minnesota kicked it off several years ago with a cost sharing program. They called it lawn to legume. They were actually, you get state help. If you're a homeowner, you want to convert some or all of your lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plantings. Great for local watersheds. Pennsylvania has a lawn conversion program for watershed protection that I just learned about. It's 2 years old. You can get up to $5,000 per acre if you're converting lawn to a natural habitat. So the motivation here is to protect the watershed, but sure, it's going to really benefit biodiversity as well. There's an island off Florida that's paying its residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. You get paid if you allow them to do that. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, you get paid to be a good steward of that species rather than fined if you use your property. Everybody would want one. Missouri and Fayetteville, Arkansas had a bounty on Callery pears, most invasive tree you can put in there. Get rid of a Callery pear, you get a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act, giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native plants. Or Buffalo's doing that. And I don't think it's anything to do with water efficiency. They're just promoting natives. It's great. And of course, we have the lawn conversion programs in the far west, which is absolutely about water. They don't have the water for lawns, but you get up to $2 per square foot rebate if you put in xeric plantings. And they're very successful programs. You know, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and they're really coming back to bite us now. The first one is that we don't think nature is essential, which means it's always going to take a back seat, because resources are always in short supply, and it always goes to, quote, essential things first. The Congress has designated the budget for our national park systems as non-essential. This is not a very big budget either. The entire budget for all of our national parks combined is equal to 1 B-1 bomber. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was a wall-sized poster here that to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That's what I'm getting from this poster. And it certainly was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. We want to preserve these places so future generations can go and enjoy them. But that suggests nature's there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. Entertainment is not essential, but nature is essential. We need nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation only to areas where there are not a lot of people, we're going to fail because those areas are too small and too isolated. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a Persian rug, a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I hate that terminology. I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again by putting the plants back, not just to make biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth between viable habitats. We want to create viable habitats where we've destroyed them, which is where we live, where we work, where we play. We're going to start to coexist with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few conservation biologists, few ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet, but I don't know why. Because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We are great at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you certainly can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. So many of us, sit at home and wring our hands. We feel powerless. The Earth's problems are so huge. What can a single person do? Well, a single person can shrink the lawn, can take out their invasive species, can put in a pollinator garden, can manage that watershed, use those keystone plants. A single person can do that and watch life come back to his or her yard. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. Just worry about the piece of the Earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. A land conservancy, a park or preserve. They're all underfunded, understaffed. They'll love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. That was absolutely wonderful. I'm just astounded by some of those numbers, and I absolutely love the pictures of your grandchildren and your granddaughter getting those. I have a 2-year-old myself who you may be able to hear in the background, but we try to get him out. It's just so wonderful to see. So thank you so much. We are going to answer questions. We're going to give people just a second to go ahead and get those questions in the Q&A box. And our conservationist, Carol, is going to help moderate those for us. While you're waiting, or if you've already put your question in, I have put a link in the chat for a survey that we're doing, just to try and get a better feel for who we have here with us. And I mentioned at the beginning, if you fill that survey out, you will be entered to win one of Doug's books. So we'll have 12 winners. So go ahead and fill that out. And while we're doing that, we did have a couple of messages in the chat. One was from Margot Bryn, who just wanted to let you know, Dr. Tallamy, that she was so inspired by your books that she bought 300 small native plants from our DEC and distributed 200 of them to her neighbors for free.
That is excellent. I thought you were going to say she brought 300 books, but native plants is second best. That's good.
Yes. And if you are putting questions in the chat, please put them in the Q&A, just because as people put things in the chat, it scrolls. And so we lose track of those questions there. So please put those in the Q&A. A lot of wonderful feedback, wonderful talk. You've given a lot of inspiration to take action. Love hearing from you, Doug. Always so informative. Very wonderful program. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we second all of those thoughts. And it looks like we have quite a few questions. So we're going to go ahead and start answering those. Carol, if you want to take it away.
Yes. First question is from Rob, and he asks, our most dominant tree in Northeast Canandaigua, the green ash, has been heavily infested by emerald ash borer, causing rapid tree death. Is there any attempt on finding and distributing a natural enemy?
Absolutely. And they're having success too. And most of that work is actually happening right on our campus. The USDA facility that does biocontrol I can see it from my building. Yeah, there's egg parasitoids and larval parasitoids, and they've been releasing them in different places for a couple of years now. There was a site in Michigan last year where there was 84% control. So that's good news. I mean, the ashes have been taking a pounding, but they're little ones out there that are still coming up, and you should be encouraged. I mean, it's been a terrible hit on the ashes for sure, but it looks like there might be a light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm going to take this opportunity to encourage people to, I know it seems crazy, but keep planting ashes, because what we're looking for is natural resistance. You know, the program of cut down all the ashes before the borer comes, that's the way to make sure that we lose any opportunity for finding out resistant genotypes. We did that with the chestnut. You know, the chestnut blight came and the loggers took every single one. So if there was 1 or 2% that were resistant, we never found them. Doing the same thing with the ashes. So it's certainly a risk that the borer will kill it, but there is, there's a little bit of resistance out there, and we've got those parasitoids going. So we don't want to give up on our ashes. There are 95 species of insects that depend on ashes. If we lose our ashes, that's 95 species gone. It's just not an option.
Nancy asks, would it be good to plant Virginia creeper around a snag?
Yes, that's a perfect place to put it. Where I would not put it is next to the house.
Yeah,
I did that.
Agreed.
I mean, and it grows. All these vines grow. So a snag is perfect for that.
Yeah, agreed. Julie would like to know which oaks are least likely to be affected by diseases, first of all, and 2 recommendations for creekside native plantings. So we can, let's see, and or top 5 plant choices for zones 4 to 5. I know she had quite a few in there.
Okay. You see, I've already forgotten the first one.
Okay, first one, which oaks
Oh, the oaks.
least likely to be affected by diseases?
Okay, it depends on where you are. Where I am right here, we've got bacterial leaf scorch. But it hits mostly the red oak group. So, if I was going to plant an oak today, I would make it the white oak group. Although it's a perfect example. I've got a lot of members of the red oak group on our property, and 2 have already died from the bacterial leaf scorch, but the others are doing fine. So right away, we've selected for some resistance. You know who's doing the selection? It's those blue jays. Because when the oak is sick, it doesn't make good acorns, and the blue jays take the best acorns and store them for the winter, and then forget where they put them, and they germinate. So the blue jays are taking the resistant varieties and planting them. If I got rid of all my red oak group, I'd lose that opportunity. But the red oak group's getting the bacterial leaf scorch. As you move a little further west, and I'm not sure if you guys are far enough west, then the white oak group is getting oak wilt. So if you've got oak wilt, focus on the red oak group, but same thing, we can't allow these diseases to beat us. I mean, if we lose our oaks, that's going to be bad news. So
her second question was recommendations for creekside native plantings. That's something Julie, I could send out, or Doug. I mean, if you wanted to touch on that.
They're
broad.
I talk about oaks as being the top keystone plant. The second, in particularly where you guys live, it's willows, native willows.
Yeah.
So, riverside, stream sides, there's a number of species of willows. sandbar willow, scrub willow, all black willow, very powerful plants. They certainly belong there. But there are other things that are really good in wet areas, like winterberry, Ilex verticillata. It can grow in standing water. So can buttonbush, great flowering plants. So can clethra, sweet pepper bush. All of those are mid-summering flowering plants that are great for the pollinators because there's not many things that flower in the midsummer, and all those can go along creek sides.
Absolutely. And then they asked top 5 plant choices for zones 4 or 5, which you just mentioned.
Well, this is why you go to that native plant finder, because it's not just zone 4 or 5, it's your county.
Right.
And look up and it'll give you top more than 5.
And Whitney, if we can put in there, and it would work the same for Canandaigua, but we can put in the chat or somewhere that the list for Chautauqua for our individual counties, because that's really easy to find. So we can do that. DJ asks, which type of milkweed does the monarch need?
Monarch eats all the milkweeds. And everybody's comparing which one's the best. You know what the monarch likes is fresh leaves. So the common milkweed tends to come up first. And if a monarch hits that plant in August, it's been up since early June or since mid-May. Mine are coming up right now. And those leaves are old and tough. So the monarch says, well, I want fresh leaves. If you were to cut back the common milkweed in maybe mid-June or the end of June, by August, it's growing up again, nice fresh leaves. The monarchs love it. So it's the tenderness of the leaves. They like swamp milkweed. We've got, Pennsylvania has, I don't know, 16 or 17 species of milkweeds, green milkweed, purple milkweed, things that people never plant, but the monarch likes all of them, so.
Right, agreed. And he asks, well, okay, we'll take care of that. Frank asks, does homegrown national park allow for importing of data, RE observations? Wondering if the data can be transferred from other citizen science platforms like iNaturalist.
Well, Homegrown National Park is not recording the biodiversity on these sites. It's just recording the area that we're converting. So it's not designed to do what iNaturalist does or eBird. Those are really good websites. So I guess the answer is no. It doesn't do that.
Well, Steve would like you to know, well, first he said, wonderful, inspiring talk. I'm halfway there because my neighbor complains my tulip poplar has gotten big enough to interrupt his dish reception. So
could that really happen? Can a tree intercept?
No, I'm sure.
I think he's making that
up. Patricia would like to know, do any other insects pupate in a hard shell? I thought all were considered quote unquote June bugs.
June bugs are beetles.
Yeah.
They have a pupa. They're complete metamorphosis. They've got a pupa just like moths and butterflies. I don't know what you mean by a hard shell. They all have exoskeletons as adults and pupae and larvae. The adult beetles have, it's hard. You know, that's why they're like little tanks instead of like sausages. So I'm not sure what the question is.
I wasn't following it quite either in terms of, so maybe she can put, if she's still there, she can add something to that.
Okay. You know, she might be thinking about the cicadas that come out and they shed their skin and leave that shell on a side of a tree. That's the shed skin that was around them when they were nymphs. And it's just obvious, we see it. But yes, all insects do that. A lot of them turn around after they shed their skin and eat it. That's what a caterpillar will do. It'll shed its skin because it's a source of protein. Insects that eat plants are always protein starved because there's so little protein, there's so little nitrogen in plants. So they'll turn around, they don't want to waste any of it.
That makes sense. Okay. Julie asks, are basswoods and lilacs useful as caterpillar food sources?
Basswood certainly, well, okay, let's be specific here. The American basswood is. Little leaf linden, which is pushed by the horticultural trade, is from Europe. And that's one of those ones where you'll see a 65% decrease in caterpillars. So plant the native linden, and it's a great tree. Lilac is, it's an ornamental plant. It is a member of it's the same plant family as ashes, and every once in a while, one of those sphinx moths that develop on ashes will use lilac, but it's ranked very low. I mean, it is a non-native plant that isn't supporting very much.
This is, how do we know which plants are native in a nursery?
Some nurseries are actually labeling them. There's a push to do that. Be careful when you ask the worker, particularly the summer hire, the high school student they hired. People think if it's growing in nature, it's native. But 30% of our natural areas are filled with Asian plants that have escaped. So just because it's growing in the woods does not make it native. There are a lot of apps these days. You can have your phone there and put in the name of the plant, and it will tell you whether it's native or not. But the nursery owner ought to know, and he ought to label it.
Yeah, and we're finding that increasing around here more and more. And what I recommend to people is don't go by common name, because so many nurseries, there's like multiple common names. If you have a particular plant that you would like that Dr. Tallamy talked about, definitely, I know it sounds, but bring the Latin name if you can write that down, because then that way it can't get screwed up with the Latin name. They'll know, or they should know what it is, or they can get it for you. So
let me recommend a book here. This is Essential Native Trees and Shrubs of the East, but it certainly applies to you guys, by Tony Dove and Ginger Woolridge. And it's got extensive charts in the beginning where it tells you how to use every one of these woody plants. So if you had this book, you could look up, see, is it native or not? And it tells you exactly how to use it in terms of shade and water and acidic soil, everything you want to know.
And then any of you guys on can obviously reach out to myself or Canandaigua, and we can hopefully answer those questions for you as well. So don't forget to ask us.
Somebody just said authors again, Tony Dove and Ginger Woolridge.
Wonderful.
Dove, D-O-V-E.
Jane has thanked you very much and says, promise we can get your message out to more than the choir that you mentioned. Sarah wants to know, is it safe to feed freeze-dried mealworms?
It's safe, but you know what happens when the mealworms die and they are dried is their innards turn to powder and kind of blow away. You're really feeding mostly exoskeleton, which has no nutritional value and the birds can't digest. So live mealworms do provide nutrition, but they're beetles. They're not caterpillars, and very low in carotenoids. They can make a difference if we have a cool, wet spring when the caterpillar populations are very low. I watched a bluebird family. No, that's a different story. It wasn't mealworms. But people have brought birds through and when it's bad weather out there with mealworms, but it's not a very balanced diet. And birds are lazy. If you train them to go to a mealworm feeder, they'll go there and they won't go forage for the things they need. So supplement, but don't, make them do what they're supposed to do.
That's interesting. Okay. Cheryl has asked, it is hard to find native shrubs. How can we tell it is a cultivated native? How can we, is it still a good option to plant is a cultivated native still a good option to plant for wildlife?
I think you mean a cultivar of a native species.
Yes, that's what I think she means. Yeah.
So that's a genetic variant of the straight species, and it's true. You go to the nursery, and most of what they offer are cultivars, because remember they've just come off 100 years where the only thing people would buy are cultivars that are enhanced for aesthetic reasons. So are cultivars as good as straight species? And the answer is, it depends on what the genetic variant was. We did a study looking at 6 cultivar traits, like what happens if you take a tall plant and you make it short, or if you enhance berry size, or if you enhance fall color, if you take a green leaf and make it red or purple. The only thing that impacted insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because you've loaded that leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. So you're taking a good native plant and making it unpalatable. When we fool with flowers, Annie White at the University of Vermont has looked at that. And again, it depends. Sometimes it enhances the flower value, but most of the time not. You're fooling around with the traits that those specialist bees have evolved with and changing them. And a double flower, and many of our cultivars are double flowers to make them showier. That's taking the reproductive parts of the flower and turning them into a petal, like double hydrangea arborescens Annabelle, or double blood roots. So they're pretty, but they're offering no pollen and no nectar, and that's certainly not helping out.
Right. What is spraying for gypsy moths going to do to the population of birds and insects in the woods?
Gypsy moth is a terrible problem. That's just, all these invasive insects are terrible problems. You don't want the gypsy moth to kill your oak trees. Most oaks, if they're planted in decent soil, can take one, certainly can take one, maybe even 2 defoliations without being harmed. But 3 or 4, it can kill them. You don't want to lose your oaks. So we spray BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, but that kills all the caterpillars. So what does it do to the birds? It takes away any food that tree was making. Remember, oaks make more food than anything else. So it's a hit. When you spray from a plain over a forest, you clobber bird reproduction in that forest. But if you don't, how many of the trees are going to die? It's just, it's a lose-lose situation. Pray for rain. I don't think we've gotten enough, but because there's a fungus that breaks out and controls gypsy moth really well if it's wet enough. And if the gypsy moth populations get really high, and usually you have to have defoliation events, then a virus breaks out and controls them really well too. But in the meantime, you've risked your trees. So it's just, it's just one of these serious problems that doesn't have a great solution.
Practically in a suburban yard, I have trouble managing all my leaves. Please offer suggestions. I am increasing my garden space and reducing the lawn. Shall I leave the leaves? The natives are pushing up through them. The non-natives need help getting uncovered.
There you go.
My
son bought a house a couple of years ago, and the first fall he called me up. He said, "Dad, I've got too many leaves. What should I do?" I said, "Break them into your flower beds." He said, "I don't have enough flower beds." I said, "Exactly." If you want to shrink your lawn and build a flower bed, that's the fastest way to do it, is rake your leaves and put it around the tree that you're building this lawn. That's how you make that safe site for those caterpillars. Because even if you put no plants there, it's all of a sudden, it's going to loosen the soil. It adds organic material to the soil. It's fertilizing the tree. It's holding moisture in. And that's all the caterpillars need. You can plant right through it. I'm actually taking pictures of places on my property where I haven't removed any leaves, and look at all the things coming through. There are some very delicate, like if you have a beautiful Phlox divaricata planting or something, and you have 4 inches of leaves on there, it's going to be hard on a lot of them. So you have to, it's a judgment call, but we're treating leaves these days the same way we treat rain with watershed management. You want all the rain to stay on your property. We want all the leaves to stay on our property, because when you throw them out, you've broken up the nutrient cycle. Those leaves they have the nutrients that the tree pulled up last year, and we've got to return it to the soil so the tree can do it again. You should never have to fertilize your trees. But you can't leave them on the lawn you're going to keep, because it will mess up the lawn. So you get them off the lawn you're going to keep, but use them to help shrink that lawn. And that's a fast way to do it.
Great idea. Craig asks, are lakefront cottages being overrun with carpenter ants, especially our shagbark hickory? And wasps, hornets are burying into the cottage. What can we safely do to control these?
Carpenter ants do not eat wood. Termites do, but carpenter ants don't. Carpenter ants will hollow out wood that has already been water damaged, as dry rot. So if you've got carpenter ants in your lakeside cottage, you probably have wood that's been compromised by flooding or raining or something. So they're living there, but they're not actually eating your house. Your house was already compromised with dry rot. Wasps, you're probably thinking of carpenter bees that do tunnel into wood. Wasps don't do that. Yeah. Again, it's a compromise. We want to kill as few insects as possible, but you don't want them to destroy your house either. So you go to your hardware store. There are shelves lined with all kinds of sprays to kill insects. Homeowners use a tremendous amount of insecticide. Most of it is absolutely unnecessary, but a few things. We do have to control termites, and I get the carpenter ant thing. After a while, they've made a lot of holes. Not the carpenter ant, the carpenter bee. So judgment call. Do it as little as possible.
Right. I know, that is a tough one when you have wooden garages and things like that in barns, because they are all over the place. Not a question, but thank you. Great presentation, and they love your new book about oaks.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And speaking of oaks, what oak produces the most acorns?
Oh,
I
I've never seen that comparison. A single oak can make up to 3 million acorns in its lifetime. But boy, I've seen massive production on the red oak group and massive production on the white oak group. So I think they all make a lot.
Okay. Is it okay to use bird feeders in our yard? Is squirrel-proof bird feeders okay to use?
Yes, but I would restrict it to the wintertime. And by wintertime, I mean, maybe late October through, like I still have mine up now, but just last week, it was down in, the low 30s. If you have a properly planted landscape, the birds don't need to be fed in the summertime. Remember, your plants are the bird feeders. And the problem with feeding throughout the summer is that it gets warm, and it's much easier for your seed to go rancid. And same thing with suet. It goes bad much easier when it's up in the 80s. And again, if it's properly planted, your birds don't need it. But during the wintertime, they do need it, because we used to have a lot of eastern prairies and a lot of meadows that were producing tons of seeds, and that's what the birds lived off during the wintertime. We don't have that anymore. Very few places. That's the most endangered terrestrial ecosystem we have, is that transitional scrub habitat that makes a lot of seed. So the birds benefit a lot by that supplemental feeding.
Right. Ellen has a ecological quandary. She plants natives, and then the invasive insects like viburnum beetles destroy them. So I turn to non-natives that are not destroyed. Native dogwoods and sugar maples no longer live well here, so we get Coosa dogwoods. What do we do?
Well, you're replacing the natives that used to contribute to your food web with plants that are kind of like plastic. So they're there and they're not being destroyed because nothing's eating them, but they're not doing what you want your plants to do. Viburnum leaf beetle is a big problem. I've got it now. I just go along squishing with my hands, but it's another one of these things. Some of the invasive insects we have, they peak, they get really bad, and then they actually go down. Things like the brown marmorated stink bug used to be terrible around here, and now they're here, but they're not bad at all. And there's some evidence that the viburnum leaf beetle is doing that as well. Coosa, our Florida dogwoods have resistance now. You don't need to plant Coosa dogwood to avoid anthracnose. The Florida dogwood's doing just fine. That problem has passed. And I forget what the other thing she said was.
Hold on a minute. I'm trying to remember native dogwood, but What I was just going to suggest is I know in our area, the dogwood is on the edge of its zone anyway. So to me, that's again, the right plant for the right location. You just have to, it has to be in a protected location for us around in this area, but we don't, I just travel, you know, south, and the native dogwoods are beautifully blooming. But once you get to lower Pennsylvania, you don't see them in the woods, or excuse me, you don't see them from here until you get to PA. So we're right on that edge there for that species. So you might want to choose maybe a native serviceberry, which would be wonderful.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
So,
You know, the Coosa dogwood makes fruits, and you might notice that nothing eats them. That co-evolved with monkeys. That fruit is for monkeys in Asia. So our animals don't eat it. But the native dogwoods make berries that are really high in fat in the fall, and it's very important for migrating birds. So, you know, yeah, right plant, right place.
Julie asked if she's able to use your terminology to spread the word through a class as a master gardener.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
I have this terminology so that you will use it.
Okay, that's what we figured.
Yes.
Let's see. When starting the effort to recapture lawn area for this purpose, how much effort should be put into improving the soil at the start of the planting process?
You know, it depends on what you're starting with. At our house, we were starting with subsoil because that's what bulldozers do. Plus the topsoil, it was 300 years of farming, and all of it was washed down in the gully. There was very little there. So what I did was the city of Newark, Delaware sucks up leaves in the fall and then composts them for a year and then puts them out for people to go use them as compost. So I went and loaded up my truck, and when I planted a plant, I would put all those leaves around it. And that's all I did. And we've got good soil now. That worked really well. Of course, the leaves that fall, they stay here, but we've got quite a bit of organic material in our soil now. So, you know, you hear it takes 1,000 years to make an inch of topsoil. That is true from a weathering point of view. That's how long it takes the rocks to weather and for that soil to accumulate. But you can speed that process up a lot by adding organic material yourself. And that's really what the plants need. You can inoculate. A lot of plants need, they've got metarrhizial. I'm having a senior moment. Mycorrhizae. Thank you. Mycorrhizae.
I was even pronouncing it wrong.
Yeah, that's a bacterium. Mycorrhizal associations that help the roots absorb nutrients. Well, so if I was worried that my soil didn't have the appropriate mycorrhizal routines, and let's say I was planting a white oak, I would plant the white oak, then I would go to an existing white oak someplace and get some soil from right around that. Not much. What you're doing is just inoculating it, or some leaf litter from under that white oak, and put it where my new planting is. And you've inoculated the soil there. Then it spreads quite rapidly. I learned years ago, I was going to do an experiment. I can't remember what it was, but it was in a greenhouse. And one of the treatments was to have absolutely no mycorrhizae in the pots. And I learned then that mycorrhizae spores move on the air. And it is really difficult to get a treatment with no mycorrhizae because they inoculate the soils all the time. And I said, well, we're worried too much about this because they're inoculating the soil.
Right.
All by themselves. So, but I did hurry things around by inoculating things myself. So,
someone has a question about hemlock woolly adelgid. They are so important, and are there any natural predators?
No, they're not. That's been a total failure in terms of biocontrol. People have tried over and over again for 30 years now, introducing small coccinellids and other things, and they can't get them to overwinter. So hemlock woolly adelgid is another invasive insect that's destroyed the hemlocks in the South and North Carolina. Everything. It's just a total disaster. Up north, porcupines really depend on hemlocks. I mean, there are reverberating consequences of losing species like this. But so far that we've just failed. I haven't been able to come up with something. So,
How is the elm on your property avoiding the Dutch elm disease?
well, good question. First of all, there are no elms anywhere around me. So, which means we have very few elm bark beetles flying around carrying Dutch elm disease. I also got seeds from the University of Delaware from the trees that didn't die. So here you're talking about the resistance that we're looking for. There are still some massive elms there. They're really gorgeous. They drop a ton of seeds. Maybe my elms in another 20 years will get Dutch elm disease. I don't know, but they're seeding in now all over the place, and I did nothing. So this is not Princeton elm. It's no special cultivar, which means they've got the full arching spread of the American elm. It's just one of these things I didn't worry about. If I had planted them and they had died in 10 years, I still would have gotten 10 years of good elm use. I still would have gotten that caterpillar, and then I could have tried again. But so far they're all fine. I haven't lost a single one.
That's awesome. Sarah asks about plants in a spongy suburban yard.
Spongy. Well, there's certainly some ferns that like spongy. It depends on whether you get full sun or not, but yeah, I think about those willows again.
And she can definitely reach out to us again for some ideas for those particular areas. So please feel free to do that. She wanted to know what you had mentioned about the best ground covers. She has a hedge of viburnum. Yep, yes. And she would like to remove the ivy.
Oh, to get rid of the ivy. That's good. Get rid of the ivy. There is a native Pachysandra.
Yeah.
That's a good ground cover. The downside there is the deer love it. So if you've got a deer issue, I wouldn't bother. Again, I would, if it's not next to the house, I would use Virginia creeper. It's a great ground cover. Or remember, ground covers can be a variety of things that move through the season. So an early ground cover, wood poppies, blooms early, and the blooms right here are disappearing at this point. But the leaves are there the rest of the season. Right. Bloodroot leaves are there the rest of the season. Foam flowers there all season. So it's not just when they're blooming. Any of these spring ephemerals, densely planted, form good ground covers.
Absolutely. And the wild ginger was the one that you had mentioned.
Yeah.
And you partner that with Solomon seal. And it looks amazing. And like you said, even it makes great ground cover, and it's not technically, at least the Solomon seal isn't technically considered a ground cover, but it does fill in.
Yeah, nice. People don't talk of it that way, but these spring ephemerals bloom in shade because they grow and bloom before the leaves are out. So they get sun in the early spring. They do their thing, and then they just hang out in the shade the rest of the year. So those are great plants for shady situations.
Let's see. I think we mentioned that one already about the gypsy moths. Do slippery elms support many insects?
Yes. Slippery elms in general. So slippery elms and American elm are great. Very highly ranked.
Let's see. This is just another question about the oaks, but I believe you mentioned, is there, all of the oaks are beneficial in terms of their insect?
Yes.
Correct.
Well,
okay.
All of the native oaks.
Yeah.
There is the Chinese oak and the English oak, and you will have a loss if you do those. But we've got 91 species of oaks. I'm not sure why we have to use Quercus sagittarius from China. I just don't get it.
True. Thoughts about the spotted lanternfly preventing further damage to our habitat? Does it make sense to try to kill them when we see them?
Absolutely. It's another invasive insect. When I say we need insects, I do not mean invasive insects, because they all cause huge problems. It's not the spotted lanternfly's fault that we brought its eggs in with ornamental rocks from China. Now we had to do that because there are no ornamental rocks in North America, none. We had to bring them in from China. I'm being facetious.
Right.
They're white eggs and they're on white rocks. And so, you know, oh, the inspector didn't find them. We do it over and over and over again because of international trade that is just unnecessary. So now the apple industry, the grape industry is just getting clobbered with these things. One thing you can do, I mean, we've got a lot at our house this year, but they spend the winter as eggs, which are pretty easy to locate. You can spray it with dormant oil, and there's a pretty good evidence that that smothers them.
Right.
Or just scrape the eggs off, but some of them get pretty high. You know, it's another problem we've created. So.
Kim asks about the native plant sources in nurseries. That's something one of us can definitely get for her. Same with where to purchase native plants. We can do that one. Let's see. My question was curiosity about what insects created exoskeletons as pupa in the ground. If I dig up one accidentally, I will bury them. Is that, I mean.
Oh, wait, a lot of pupae are in the ground, and every once in a while I dig them up. But so they have an exoskeleton around them, but they're, if it's hollow, it means it's already emerged.
It's already, right.
But if you dig it up, it probably is not hollow. What I would do, if you just buried it again, then it doesn't have its little chamber and everything else. I would bury it under some leaves without putting soil on it.
And Sarah, we did mention that serviceberry. She asked if serviceberry is a good one to plant. But yes, but make sure there are lots of cultivars out there with the what goes along with the serviceberry. So make sure that it is the native one that you purchase. Again, just if you can do that, that would be more desirable.
You know, when we go to the nursery and we say, I want to buy something straight species, and he said, well, I don't carry that. You say goodbye. And if enough people do that, they'll start to carry it. They just want to sell plants, and they're not convinced that there's a market for the straight species. So if we want to buy straight species for function, we have to create that market. And it's you and me who are going to do that.
Correct. Let's see. We did that one. We mentioned about tent caterpillars. And we're going to get out the information for the native perennials. Does the growing of hemp have any benefit for the insects? I've never heard.
I don't know. I don't know where hemp is native to. I have no idea. If it's not native, it's going to have minimal impact. So.
Right. All right. I think we are through everything, Whit, I think.
All right, great. Sorry, yeah, and I think that second question, I was typing some answers in the chat, but that one question on there was the follow-up to the hard skeleton question that we were confused about at the beginning.
Right.
She was following up, explaining what she meant.
Yeah.
So
I think I know what she means at this point.
Yeah. So that is all of the questions. I did put Carol's email in the chat. I know that there were a lot of questions about where to find a native plant nursery. The best way to, since we don't, unless you filled out that survey, if you fill out that survey, we have your email, but if you didn't, we don't have everybody's email addresses. So reach out to Carol. I put her email in the chat there. We're happy to answer any more questions. Lindsay, if you guys also want people, you can go ahead and put your email in there too. I know some of the people are from your watershed as well. So with that, Doug, thank you again. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah.
You know, we really appreciate it. And clearly the people are excited to hear Dr. Tallamy speak, because we had 100 and I think at the most I saw like 117 people between. I was also monitoring Facebook where we had it streaming. So we had quite a few people on here, and I just keep thinking, if everybody who attended today just planted one oak, we would have 117 more oaks.
Exactly.
So it's pretty wonderful. So we really appreciate your time, and we really appreciate everyone's time for attending. So with
Well,
that,
thanks
we'll
for
let
the
it go.
opportunity.
Well,
Yes.
thank you again.
Thank you. So much great information shared. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody.